Hello and welcome to another episode of the Center Studio podcast. I'm your host, Glenn Nelson. Today, I'm excited to talk about a pioneer of Latter-day painting, the subject of a new book by Jennifer Champoux. It just came out, and the book is titled C.C.A. Christensen, a Mormon Missionary. I love this book, Jenny. I can't wait to talk with you about it. It was published by the University of Illinois Press, and I think it's a real gem. It's one of those books on art that is a prerequisite for literacy in LDS art and culture, I think. And you've done an extraordinary job of taking a figure who I think was once familiar in previous years in LDS culture, but has slipped away a bit from prominence, undeservedly, in my opinion, today. So welcome. It's great to have you as my guest.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Glenn. I'm a big fan of all the good work that you do. And boy, can I quote you on that? It's a prerequisite for
It's for
LDS art literacy.
Sure. Well,
Thank
it's
you.
too late for a blurb. I
I
wasn't
know.
blurb, although you got some very impressive blurbs on this book. Anyway, so I'd love to ask you questions about C.C.A. Christensen, of course, and his work, but I'd love to talk with you first about the book itself. Like, how did you become interested in him? And I know that you gave a presentation in like 2019 or so at
Yeah.
a conference, but does your connection with him go back even further than that?
Yeah, that was the first time I had started thinking about him in a scholarly way. I When I first started looking at his art in around 2018, I just couldn't believe that I wasn't more familiar with it. I thought the art was exciting and different, and something felt very immediate about
Hmm.
it. And it just spoke to me in a way that I thought, wow, this is some of our earliest Latter-day Saint art. And I'm an art historian, and it's not very familiar to me, much less to sort of a general audience, either within the church or just as scholars of American art history. And I was shocked at how little had been published on him. It was hard to find much information, and so I started going to primary sources in the church history library, his journals and letters, and looking at the art. Spent a lot of time just looking at the art and thinking about it, reading about his life, and yeah, I felt like he was someone that we should be more familiar with, and I actually think did have a big impact on Latter-day Saint thought and art in a way that he hasn't really been given credit for.
Yeah, well, I can't wait to dive in with those questions about that. But in New York, where I live, he is a little bit more known because at the Whitney Museum in the 70s, there was a big show of his work, and it
Right.
was on the cover of Art in America magazine and so on. And in a way, he was a proxy for Mormon art. The article I'm quoting from in Art in America said, other than the Quakers, the Mormons are like the most important American contributor as a religious culture, and we know everything about the Shakers and nothing about the Mormons. That's what the article said in the 70s.
Wow. Yeah.
I'd love to ask you about the series too, Introductions to Mormon Thought.
Uh-huh.
This is editors Matthew Bowman and Joseph M. Spencer. And so I think they're up to around 10 titles now, and yours is the latest or second latest. They're kind of
Yeah, I
cranking
think
but tell me about that series. What's its goal?
sure. Yeah. I think I might be number 8, but I'm not positive. And they do have several more in the works. I know there's one coming out in October and another one in March. And then there are others that are currently being written. And the idea is to give accessible introductions to these figures from Latter-day Saint history that have shaped Latter-day Saint culture, or I guess I should say Mormon culture, because they're taking that term pretty broadly in terms of
Yeah.
what Mormon culture, uh, and how they've shaped our history and our thought. And what I love about this series is they're not afraid to bring in figures that are lesser known. I mean, they're including the big names that you might think of, but also people you might not be aware of. And I've really enjoyed reading the other volumes in the series that are out already, and have learned so much about these people that have influenced us, and just learning more through their lives, learning more about the history of the church too. You probably saw there was just a biography on Richard Bushman in the series
Really
that done by
recently.
J.B.
That's
Haas.
right.
It was
Yeah.
excellent. Yeah.
You know, in culture, it kind of amasses like the proverbial snowball going down, the hill and gets bigger and bigger. And when you are born, your culture is just what's around you, and you don't know how it arrived, and you don't know what was collected into that gigantic snowball. So I love this thing. I don't know how these two editors do all that they do. I mean,
They,
they're very
I
busy
know.
people.
I know.
It's
Matt and Joe are like superhuman in the way that they can just have so many great ideas and make it happen.
hats off to them, really.
Mhm.
I think that most people, know C.C.A. Christensen because of his panoramas primarily,
Mhm.
those
Yeah.
extraordinary multi-panel works that one critic referred to as proto-cinema, a book about early Mormon cinema. He lumps Christensen into that. And your book starts there in 1880, and he toured around with these to the early saint settlements in the West and reviewed with these people what their history had been using these panels. But could you give us a little bit more information about them and what that experience might have been like for people in these audiences?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I love thinking about what it was actually like there. And I read some Deseret News article reviews from that time that talked about it. And they talked about people packing into a local schoolhouse or chapel and seeing this presentation. And they were very popular. He would travel around. Well, let me back up. Let me tell you first
Describe them a little.
what it is. um, so huge canvases, 10 feet wide by 6 feet tall. He started with several and kept adding to them. He ended up at finally having 23 of these scenes. And each one was stitched to the other one so that they would be put on these um, like dowels and then rolled across. And so you'd see one scene at a time, and then the next one would roll across. And the whole performance it wasn't just visual. He also had a prepared lecture that he would deliver to give more information about what the people were seeing. And it was very emotional. He included names of real people. He, didn't shy away from the violence of the persecution that the saints had experienced. And in fact, I think really wanted to exaggerate and emphasize the persecution, the level that they had experienced. There were hymns. They would, between scenes, there would be hymn singing, and there were stage lights. There were usually curtains that he would set up around it. So it was very much like an early cinema, very theatrical.
Huh. And did people pay to go to
They
these?
they did, yeah. I saw in one Deseret Evening News advertisement in Salt Lake City in 1880, they were charging 25 cents for adults and 20 cents for children. I
Okay.
don't, yeah.
That sounds like maybe a lot.
Yeah,
I think it's a significant amount.
he did. Usually about a third of the proceeds would go back to that ward, to help fund things in that ward. And then Christensen, of course, had costs for traveling. There was this is a little tidbit that I just kind of pulled at my heartstrings. I saw one Deseret News article in 1880 saying, Christensen's coming tomorrow. Don't miss the Mormon Panorama presentation in the 14th Ward tomorrow at 7:30. And then the next day in the newspaper, there was a little blurb saying, if anyone's found C.C.A. Christensen's horses, they strayed from the tithing office yard. And if you have any information, please meet Christensen at the tithing office to return his horses. I thought, I hope he got his horses back to get home.
All right. You mentioned other panorama presenters, including Philo Dibble. I didn't know that.
Mhm.
Is this an element of American art history? I mean, I really don't know all that much about this period. I mean, were these kinds of presentations happening all over the country? They kind of sound like illustrated lyceum lectures, like their version of a TED Talk or something. And I remember reading a little bit about James Talmage and had all these glass slide presentations that he would travel around. Are these things kind of related?
That's interesting about Talmage. I'm not as familiar with that. I do know that in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, there was a big panorama movement in America, and that was centered in St. Louis. So actually not that far from Nauvoo, where the saints were. And I think they would have been exposed to some of that hype around the panorama and the popularity of those. Sometimes they would travel around. And then when the saints moved to Utah, there were, like you said, Philo Dibble, Reuben Kirkham was another one who did Latter-day Saint related panoramas.
Huh.
And in fact, Philo Dibble, once C.C.A. Christensen started touring with his Mormon panorama, Philo Dibble was kind of upset because he'd already been doing that, and he felt like Christensen was like coming into his territory, taking his business. And I think he even filed a lawsuit or a complaint or something. Yes. So it was already a known format and media that people were familiar with.
Yeah. Interesting. Given the scale of it, it must have been kind of quite immersive.
Hmm.
And so this must have felt real. I mean, more real to them. So I find
Right.
that really interesting. You were just talking a little bit about some of the purposes of these presentations themselves. And part of Christensen's importance is this shared memory of early saints in the West, as you write, the meaning in his art that echoed and affected Mormon thought. And I was thinking, as these decades passed, the number of people who had experienced Midwest persecution firsthand or who knew Joseph Smith personally, for example, were kind of on the wane. Is that something that you think was important, to this project?
Yes, that's a great insight, Glenn. And I think you're exactly right. I think that was a driving motivation for Christensen. And in fact, he wrote about that in a newspaper article about wanting to preserve this history for the younger generation that was born in Utah and hadn't experienced things the same way. And he wanted them to remember it. And I think that's why he made it so emotional. And um, I mean, sometimes it's kind of violent, like showing the violence against the saints in the early days of persecution. And he wanted them to remember that. It's important to keep in mind he's painting these, 50 or 60 years after the events that occurred. And when you think about what's going on in the 1880s in Utah, there is this renewed moment of struggle with the United States government as they're trying to get statehood but being rejected, and they're dealing with polygamy and United States laws against unlawful cohabitation. And so there is this, I think, sense of wanting to remember that they've already been through this kind of thing with the United States, and they left because of that, and they want to preserve the sort of religious liberty that they've established for themselves out in Utah.
You know, I mean, they had occupation, they had,
Hmm.
they had wars, they had armies coming in, they had threats of wars. So, as we would say today, this was quite relevant.
Yeah.
It resonated with them for sure.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Let's see. I don't know if I should do this, but one of these paragraphs on this really struck me. I think I will read it. This is writing in 1879 to a Danish newspaper in Utah. The old generation who bore the burdens of the day of the persecutions in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois will no longer be with us a few years hence. History will preserve much, but art alone can make the narrative of the suffering of the saints comprehensible for posterity.
Yeah,
That boils
exactly.
it down.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. That's a great quote. And one thing I noticed was even though Joseph Smith had already been martyred by the time that C.C.A. came over from Denmark to America, so he never knew Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith appears a lot in the Mormon panorama. Brigham Young never does. And to
Hmm.
me, that indicates that he is really interested in preserving this early history. Like it's less about the current moment and more about remembering how they got where they are.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should back up a bit.
Mhm.
We just launched into this without even saying who this guy is. So,
Okay.
was Carl Christian Anton Christensen? Where did he come from?
Mhm.
Where was he trained? All that kind of stuff.
Sure. Yeah, he was born in Copenhagen, Denmark, and in 1831, and he grew up in a very poor family. His mother worked extremely hard to support her boys. She ended up having to put him and I think one of his brothers into a poorhouse boarding school.
Yeah.
And that was where he first started learning some skills. He was apprenticed to a toy maker, and he started learning some craft skills there. Um, a wealthy widow noticed his skills and agreed to fund his training at the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Art, which was a huge opportunity for him, something he would never have been able to do on his own. So thank you to her. And he started his training there. But while he was about halfway through his art training, and this is, one of the greatest European art academies at the time, then he joined the church. The first missionaries came over and he joined the church. And then, even in his own journals, he talks about how suddenly his art training was not as important to him. He was just all in on the church. He was translating hymns into Danish. He was reading the Book of Mormon. He got ready to go on a mission in Scandinavia. And and so he finished his art training. He technically graduated from the school, but he never took the highest level courses there, like the live model figure drawing classes. And you see that in his art that it's not always technically perfect.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
I want to talk about that in
yeah,
some detail
yeah.
a little
Hmm.
bit later. But
Okay, we'll
you're
come back.
exactly right. I mean, or at least your version of things align with mine, so therefore you're right. Um, something that I had never heard about C.C.A. Christensen was his work other than painting.
Yeah.
So his first autobiography came out in 1853. Tell us a little bit about Christensen, the writer.
Oh my gosh, I loved learning about this.
Had you known that
Uh,
before?
yeah, I did not realize what a writer he was, and he wrote poetry, he wrote hymns, he wrote articles, he wrote letters to the editor in newspapers that were communal calls to action. He just he, he was a pretty incredible man because he had so many interests and took the time to write about those things and explore them. He wrote theological kinds of essays, so many things. So yeah, I think he's actually a terrific poet. His poetry often has a lot of humor in it. It's very accessible, and I think some of his hymns, I don't know if they're still in the Danish hymn book today, but I know for years his hymns were sung both in Utah in the Danish communities there and back in the old country in
Okay.
Scandinavia.
Huh. You know, the book refers to a poem he wrote on his second mission. And I don't know if you have your copy of the book handy,
Yeah.
but page 10, he's talking about, you know, being really far away from home. And
Yeah.
he has a family at this point. And,
Mhm.
you're called and you leave everything behind and it's not like you can get a letter off to them and then hear back very quickly. So
That's
I'm
right.
sure all of these kinds of feelings were just, it would have had to have been overwhelming to people. But would you mind reading that poem on page
Sure.
10?
Sure, and let me mention this was, in 1865, and it was in the Danish hymn book of the church, and, it was written in Danish, and here it's been translated by, Richard L. Jensen. So this is his translation into English. "Do they miss me at home in the valley? Am I mentioned among those I love? When the children are lovingly hugged and kissed, oh, how I wish I were near! When early they kneel for prayer and angels smile at the little ones, do anyone's thoughts dwell on the one who now must be lonely. Sad. Yeah.
Get,
He was far away in Scandinavia on his second mission.
yeah.
Yeah.
You know, Christensen reminds me of another LDS artist of the period, Henry Lavender Adolphus Colmer. These people have very long names. H.L.A. Colmer is the way that most people refer to him, and he was primarily a painter, but also a poet, a nature explorer, a man of the theater, a composer. Is that name familiar to you at all?
I'm not familiar with him.
Yeah, I was just wondering because the two seem to be cut from the same cloth, lived in the same place at the same time, and I wonder if artists like them were just like trying to cobble a living together. And so their
Hmm.
creativity spilled out in many different directions. Or if in those days they just like had this broader view of what a creative life was like. Like today, it's
Hmm.
quite siloed. You know, if you self identify as a sculptor, sometimes that's all you do, right?
Hmm.
But I wonder, did he, other than regarding his livelihood, painting was part of it. What other things did he do for his
Hmm.
livelihood?
Yeah. When he first came to Utah in 1857, really he just had to be a farmer for a while. And so he was farming wheat and potatoes and corn and taking odd jobs on the side, trying to get some painting jobs where he could. He was not trying to be a fine art painter at that time because there really was not a market for it.
Right.
He did do some painting in the Springville Theater for some scenery there. This was in the maybe 1862, sometime around then. And then that led him to get a commission to do some painting in the Salt Lake Theater in 1863.
Yeah.
Uh, but really, that's the biggest thing he does until the 1870s. So for for 15 or 20 years, he's mostly living in Sanpete County as a farmer, painting houses or shutters. He, um,
Coffins, I read.
yeah,
Was
yeah,
that a
apparently,
thing? Painting coffins?
apparently, yeah, yeah,
Well, I have to see photos of that. I
yeah.
can't quite visualize what that is. My thought goes to Egypt, but I'm curious
Oh,
what that is like. You know,
mm-hmm,
around 1877, Christensen begins another sequence of panoramas, but these had a very different purpose.
mm-hmm.
Uh, can you talk about these Lamanite works?
So the untitled Huntington panorama one, yeah, this is an interesting art piece that just was rediscovered in the past decade. Really, it
Is it
had
that shocking to you?
totally,
Just okay.
yeah,
All right. That's a conversation for another day. But
yeah.
I find that shocking. But go ahead.
Right. It was in someone's attic and had just been passed down through, actually, it was, so Dimmick Huntington and George Washington Hill were missionary companions at the time, and they were called to preach to some of the Ute and Paiute and Shoshone people in the area. And so it ended up in George Washington Hill's family, and that was the descendant that had it. And I have to mention, they said that it had been used as a Matchbox car racetrack at one point by grandchildren. So it's long. It's about 22 feet long. Be about a foot and a half or 2 feet wide. Yeah, probably almost 2 feet wide. And it has 11 scenes. So different from the Mormon panorama, which went horizontally across. This one is a vertical thing, and it's all just one long piece of linen muslin, and then
Right.
there's just 11 scenes, almost like a comic strip, kind of, but just in a vertical.
Yeah,
And
panels.
so they, Dimmick Huntington asked C.C.A. to create this, we think, for as a visual aid in their preaching to the indigenous people there in the
Okay.
area. So it covers.
The
Go
flip
ahead, sorry.
chart version of 1877 or whatever.
The first flip chart, maybe, right?
All
Yeah.
right.
It covers sort of the history of God's people, starting with Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah's flood, Jesus, some of Jesus's ministry, the baptism of Jesus, his crucifixion, his appearance in the New World and calling his apostles there. But then it also includes some Book of Mormon moments, like Lehi's family leaving Jerusalem, arriving in the Promised Land, and Moroni and Mormon safeguarding the plates at the end of their civilization, and then finally ends with Joseph Smith receiving those plates from the angel Moroni.
Yeah. I have multiple thoughts. I'm still thinking about them in somebody's attic. Maybe we should take out a giant ad
Yeah,
and say, okay, everybody, if you're a multi-generational person in the church, just go up into your attic right now.
yeah,
Like, we want to know because things are still coming out. Anyway, critical.
it's amazing. Yeah.
Okay, but back to these panels. So then I love when I'm reading a book and I know a little bit about the person or the subject, but not all that much. And I come across things that just are so surprising to me that I'd never considered even why that would be true. And in your writing about the next series of works, these Book
Mhm.
of Mormon paintings, I was really surprised the way that you described how rare those were. Like
Mm,
that fine art paintings mostly didn't exist
yeah.
in the first, did you say 40 years or so? You write very little fine art painting and essentially no religious theme painting exists from the initial 40 years of the church from 1830 to 1870. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, I feel like I should add a caveat there that there was painting done for temples and tabernacles that was essentially just copies of famous European religious paintings, mostly images of Christ. So there were some artists, but even that was more 1870s or 80s, 90s. So yeah, they're just, I have to think it had something to do with these people being pioneers out there in Utah. And that just, they had to get established first before they could have space for that kind of fine art community and patronage.
Are you
But
making a
then,
distinction between the works, like fine art works, and those that might have existed as commissions for, many church publications, magazines, but did they put new images in about the gospel, the script, Latter-day Saint scripture and so on?
in church magazines at the time.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just wondering when you say
Yeah.
fine art paintings, are you
Mhm.
saying that that's separate from another body or that kind of nothing existed?
Oh, I guess when I say fine art, I'm distinguishing that from like painting houses and shutters and coffins and
Yeah.
banners and stage scenery.
Yeah.
I I would maybe put that in a separate category from a framed standalone canvas or a temple mural. Um, but so much of that early art, when the Latter Day Saints did start producing those kind of easel paintings, was landscape. As you know, the Paris art missionaries and John Hafen and Loris Pratt, and they were mostly doing European style impressionistic landscapes. There were really only a few people trying to tackle the visualization of Latter-day Saint history and scripture, and C.C.A. was one of them. And I think became with this Book of Mormon series that you mentioned, his work there became more broadly disseminated than any other religious art at the time, because it was published as lithographs by the Deseret Sunday School
Yeah.
Union and sent to all the Sunday schools.
Yeah.
Mm.
As I read the book, which hey audience, which I absolutely loved and warmly recommend, the thing that stayed with me even more than the biography and history was the brilliant way that you interpreted these works. So let's talk about landscapes a little bit more. We just referenced them a little bit, but I would love to get interpretation into this a little bit more. Many of these landscape paintings or scenes are set in the rugged outdoors that Christensen was making. Could you talk a little bit about the symbolism of forests and the wilderness that appear in your book, particularly in those early paintings and panoramas and other
Oh,
works?
thank you. Yeah. Thanks. I really appreciate that question. it was one of my motivations for this book was I felt like when I saw Christensen's work discussed anywhere, it was often just as a vehicle to talk about the history, and very few people had ever really analyzed the paintings themselves as documents that could tell us something just just by what the painting itself says. Even
Or to go deeper into any of the paintings.
right, right, yeah. Even you mentioned Carl Karmer in the 1970 Art in America. his he doesn't really analyze the paintings. He shows all the paintings, but he has just a little historical blurb with each one, and he doesn't really talk about what is Christensen doing here. How is he using the language of art to tell a story? And that's what I wanted to think more deeply about. And I actually think Christensen is so good at this and is very sophisticated in the way that he uses traditional European fine art symbolism and composition to create these really interesting commentaries on the Latter-day Saint experience, and also just what it means to be a disciple in the world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one phrase that you wrote was wilderness marks the divide between right and wrong, civilization and wilderness, and acceptance and exile. I love that interpretation because many of these images have this dividing line, the
Mhm.
edge of the forest where it has been tamed or where Joseph is preaching or whatever, and then what is going on in the forest. And in my background with art history is just a standard, overview. And when we would get to the periods like the Hudson River painters and whatever
Yeah.
with their, you know, oversized grandeur of nature and the relative tininess of man, almost insignificant in this giant thing. That's not the same purpose as what you're describing to me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I do see some similarities that Christensen does often have small figures in this enveloping landscape or wilderness. But yeah, he's definitely influenced by these ideas about these longstanding Christian ideas about chosen people and exodus and having to move through a kind of a wilderness and coming out on the other side to build a better community. But then also it's this moment too where he's there, painting these in the 1870s and 80s, thinking about American expansion ideology and the idea of progress, meaning pushing, the frontier west and cultivating the land. And then also these Latter-day Saint thoughts about America and the history of God's people in America and these thoughts about salvation and restoration and how that's all tied up. And you see this in the rhetoric of the church leaders too at the time. It's all tied up with the land and cultivating the land and building Zion. And it's a fascinating mix of these three different ideas that I think Christensen is pulling from. And like you said, he does really interesting symbolism, like this dividing line of civilization and wilderness. And he uses that very, very successfully as a visual device to help tell that story throughout the series of Mormon panorama paintings.
One of the famous paintings of his is this predominantly blue image where the saints are crossing the frozen river. And even that forest, which is, deciduous trees in wintertime that have no leaves, that's symbolic too.
For sure.
The
Yeah.
forest is gone. And so it's not like uh, American art at the period. It was this post Edenic thing where man was supposed to tame nature. You know,
Hmm.
it was supposed to go. It was supposed to be subjugated because of that.
Yeah.
And maybe there's an element here, but it seems slightly different. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that's right. Um, there's an interesting duality of the wilderness where it's it shows up in his art as both a place that the saints are pushed into unfairly, unjustly. But it's also a place where they meet God. So
Hmm.
it's, there's a scene of when the last people who had left Nauvoo have crossed the river and they're camping in the forest, and many of them are sick or infirm, and God sends quail to feed them. And so there's this scene of them catching all these quail in the camp. And so there's this sense of they're pushed into the wilderness, but then they find God and providence in the wilderness and protection there too. And that, I think that's really fascinating. That kind of, I mean, even, I mean, right? I mean, Joseph Smith gets the gold plates and right in a in a forested hill. So I don't know. I think that's a really
That
interesting duality.
and the first vision itself. You know,
Yeah,
our
yeah,
origin story is in the middle of a forest.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
And so, unlike other painters who were either showing it as a dark and evil place or a place that was divine and beyond comprehension, those two
hmm
kinds of separate things, this is a slightly different approach.
yeah,
Fascinating to me. Yeah, some of these early Utah painters um, had an interesting effect on government policy regarding the wilderness. So
hmm
they would go to these really remote places. Again, I'm talking in Utah now, where other people hadn't been, and they were making artwork and sending that back to the government with a plea to protect these lands.
well,
And I'm not sure Christensen is part of that, but Colmer was, and Lynn Fawcett was, and a whole bunch of photographers were. And so I find that kind of fascinating because
yeah,
our view of the land, the Mormon view of the land, is this thing that's going to be paradisiacal, you know.
hmm hmm
So I think I don't know.
yeah.
I might just be making stuff up. I don't know if
Not at
this.
all. No, that's really interesting.
Yeah, let's talk about style a little bit. We
Mhm.
hinted earlier about the way that he draws a figure, for
Yeah.
example, as being slightly different than things. So one of the things that I'm trying to do in my life is remove as much bias as I can generally, and I have to confess that growing up I didn't really respect folk art and outsider art as I do now, and
hmm
I did value artists who were self-taught as highly as I did academically trained ones. And, Christensen always was not a self-taught artist, but his technique, particularly the figure, is closer to folk art than, let's say, an
hmm
old master technique.
Sure.
So I had punted on that question earlier, but let's get into it a tiny bit
Okay.
now. Um, what do you make of, well, let me give you one more idea. I think it's a common problem that when we're looking at art, we incorrectly conflate technique and philosophical rigor. And
Hmm.
so here you've got these sections of your book that are talking about interpretation and
hmm
making a really strong case that a tree is not just a tree.
Yeah.
You and so, but I would say that the trees are represented quite beautifully, but sometimes for me, the figures are a little bit of a stumbling block for me
Sure.
personally. And I'm coming around to seeing them in a new way. But what do you make of that? Do you feel that that was intentional? Was he bumping up against the limitations of his own technique? Was it a
hmm
stylistic choice? What do you think?
Yeah, that's great. I do think it was partly just the limitations of his training. I I don't know. I don't know if it was a stylistic choice because it's something he continues always. And he was such a perfectionist in his writing, and in his art too. He'd write journals on his mission and then come home and rewrite them in
Oh,
beautiful scripts and edit things to make it nicer. So, I mean, he was a perfectionist. I think he wanted to do it the best that he could. And I think you're right that his figurative work is not on a par with someone like Karl Bloch, right? Who was a contemporary of his.
classmate,
Yeah,
school.
classmate, right? Mhm. Yeah, in Denmark. But what I like about Christensen is even though his technique or his execution is not perfect, you always see him striving to do something. And I think that's a mark of greatness when you can push yourself to do something that is really beyond your abilities. And I imagine that was probably a little frustrating for him that he couldn't execute it um, in a more finished way. But I see that striving element in so much of his life, in his art, but also just the way he lived his life, that he was always wanting things to be more than they were. He wanted to build a better community. He wanted to build the church. He was always urging his community to something higher. And I think in his art, although, he may not be capturing something perfectly, he does capture something essential and something that can speak to the viewer in a really deep way.
Yeah, well, that's beautifully said, which doesn't surprise me. Everything that you say is beautifully said in my mind.
You're
You know,
kind.
there is an interesting and positive consequence of this because he has some limitations with the figure. Um, he relies on gesture. And
Mm,
so these people are doing stuff. They're pointing to things. They're in action mode.
yeah.
Um, and so there's more dynamism in the paintings than you would typically find in an artist who was not trying to, be more aspirational, as you're describing, I think.
Interesting point. Yeah. I think he definitely learned that from his academic training in Denmark. I mean, the Danish Golden Age history painting, which is, big scenes from history or the Bible or mythology, would often, especially Danish art at that time, would use these kind of pointing, gesturing figures to lead your eye to the important part of the scene or to help send the message that they want you to take away from it, to just make the picture a little more easily readable for the viewer. Um,
Makes perfect sense to me. One of the things, as far as breakthroughs in the visual style of our culture, you describe his attempting to fashion a new Latter-day Saint iconography
mhm.
because of his depiction of heavenly beings. Can you
Yeah.
describe that a little bit?
Yeah. So he depicted in the Mormon panorama, the first the first scene of the first of the 23 scenes is, we don't know what happened to it.
Yes,
So
lost.
it's lost. So we have 22. And the first one that that we still have is of Joseph Smith receiving the plates from the angel Moroni. And there the angel Moroni does not have wings, but he is hovering off the ground. And then later in his 1891 Book of Mormon series, he depicts the vision of Nephi, where Nephi sees a vision of the virgin and child, and it's pointed out to him by a heavenly messenger or an angel. And this time, Christensen, again, the angel doesn't have wings, but he's very firmly planted on the ground, and he's very clearly in a moment of space and time with Nephi. And they're looking at this vision up in the clouds. But these two embodied people are clearly there together. And that is really revolutionary
Yeah,
for
that's a break from the Western European
right.
tradition.
I mean, the wings, like the lack of wings was already a break. And then this having an angel that is embodied and can exist in space and time in a way that, yeah, that's brand new. And that's Christensen drawing on his European art tradition, but adapting it to Latter-day Saint beliefs.
But it kind of is an echo of what we were talking earlier about the philosophical rigor. You know,
Mm.
he's processing these things and he's just not regenerating tropes, which is a very common religious painting thing
Yeah.
in the tradition. I
Yeah.
find that really, really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah, that's great.
I'd like to conclude our discussion. It's going by so fast. I apologize. The same way that you do in your book. So with thoughts about his blending of Scandinavian, American, and Mormon identities. I find that chapter in this book to be really extraordinary, and it just means a lot to me personally. In Utah at the turn of the century, 19th, 20th century, the admonition from the official church was for immigrants that spoke languages other than English to learn English and
Hmm.
more to adopt American manners and customs. I didn't know that. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that was the goal, although there certainly were pockets of ethnic groups that settled in certain places, right? I mean, even still today, you
Sure.
think, right, Midway, sort of Scandinavian, and right, and Sanpete County is still a lot of Scandinavian, mostly Danish. Emery County has a lot of Swedes, and that's still the case today that those families have stayed. um, but there was some tension there, although I think the church and I think a lot of the members wanted to adopt this Latter-day Saint identity that superseded their prior
Yeah.
national or ethnic identities. There was still a tension there, and that, I mean, these people had, hundreds of years of history of feeling certain ways about each other, and now they're supposed to be neighbors and ward members
Interesting.
together.
They had all these foreign language newspapers and associations and groups, and I
Yeah,
can imagine these converts feeling very homesick for their
for sure.
birthplaces. I mean,
Yeah.
surely many of them gave up families and everything they knew to immigrate, and they must have been quite nostalgic for things from home. So
Hmm.
Christensen's paintings of Scandinavia are sweet to me, and
Hmm.
maybe that's because my ancestors came from Sweden and Germany, and I just know that they loved where they came from. My great grandfather was just one of those that you just described. He came to the church as a teenager. He was the only one of his family to convert. He found his way to the Saints in the West. He lived in Cedar City, Utah, and other than me, everybody in the family still lives there.
Oh, well.
And and so the idea that somebody could make so many radical changes in their life, all under the pressures of prosecution and wars, is hard for me to comprehend. So
Hmm.
how did Christensen blend all these identities? And I mean, like, how do you see that in paintings and his writing?
Yeah, that's a great question. He he again wanted to preserve that heritage for the younger generation, especially right his children and grandchildren that were born in Utah and never knew the homeland that he came from. So he continued to write poems and hymns in Danish. He helped organize annual Scandinavian celebrations in Manti and Ephraim. He would often read his Danish poems as part of those, celebrations. He taught the Danish language at the Sanpete, what was it? Sanpete Stake Academy, which is now Snow College down there. Um, so he was teaching the younger people Danish so they would know that language too, which is so interesting because early when he first joined the church, he was so quick to learn English, and it's amazing how quickly he was able to learn English and write, even in his personal journals, to write in English really well. And then at the end of his life, he's like, "Well, wait a minute, let's not forget Danish, and I
Yeah.
want to teach you guys some Danish, and here's some things you should know about it." And then he does these paintings, about a dozen beautiful, small, mostly small, kind of like a 10 by 12 kind of size, of these mostly countryside scenes in
Weighing the
Denmark and Norway.
baby.
Oh, Wayne the Baby. Yeah, that's actually earlier from his career. Yeah, I love that one. Nice little domestic scene.
Yeah. For somebody who had been so conscious
Mhm,
of culture building,
mhm.
I wonder if he said, because he's talking about losing culture in the case of the Nauvoo in the earlier period in Utah, but then later I can completely hear him say, wait, I also have this culture from the old world that I don't want to have you lose that either.
That's right, yeah, and he wrote about it too in that Danish newspaper you mentioned in Utah. He wrote many articles and essays about his missions in Scandinavia. Um, so yeah, he in every way he was trying to Oh, and then he worked in the church historian's office helping compile the history of the Scandinavian mission with Andrew Jensen. So he was going at it from every angle, trying to preserve that heritage for the next generations.
Yeah. I love the ending section of your book where you list many of the known paintings by C.C.A. Christensen, nearly 100 of them, and you point out where they are, public and private collections. How can people learn more about his visual artworks? I don't know if all of these are very accessible.
Yeah, unfortunately, many of them are, I mean, I shouldn't say unfortunately. Unfortunately for us who want to see them, many of them are still in private collections of descendants. Um, the Church History Museum does have quite a few. The BYU Museum of Art has his Mormon panorama. Um,
Springville?
Springville has one, yeah. The Utah Museum at the U has one. I will say there was a catalog in 1984 by Richard Oman and Richard Jensen that was part of an exhibition at the Church History Museum. It was actually the opening exhibition for that museum. And that catalog probably has the most complete set of images of his art. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to include all the images. Printing color images is expensive. And the ones I was able to print in here was thanks to the Charles Redd Center at BYU, who uh, through a publication grant allowed us to include those images, which I just felt like you cannot have a book about an
Well,
artist
it's hard.
and talk about the art, and especially when people aren't as familiar with these images, you have to be able to look at them. So I'm so grateful that the Redd Center was able to do that.
You know, people who follow art just a little bit is not really their thing, and who are members of the church. They have this mistaken idea that there is some giant repository where all of these images exist, all these paintings and drawings and sculptures and prints, whatever, exist, and anybody who's really into it can go and find these things. That's not the case. Or that there's this giant library and all you do is you go and you like look things up. There aren't very many books, really,
Right.
about this. So
Hmm.
this book of yours, I think, is just, can we call it canonical?
Yeah.
It's not that big of a book. It's like whatever 150 pages or something.
Yeah.
But you know, there just aren't many books like this, and there should be many, many, many more books like this. Don't you agree?
That's so kind of you, Glenn. I feel the same way, and I think you and I are on the same page there. That's one of our driving motivations in the work that we both do, is trying to catalog and make accessible the history of all forms of art in the Latter-day Saint tradition. I have to mention my Book of Mormon art catalog. Is that okay?
Please.
So that, and you can also find many of these images there. It's a public online digital database of Book of Mormon art, and art related to church history, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price. And we have about 13,000 images that we've cataloged in there, and it's growing all the time. And it includes art from members all over the world, things that, like you said, are often hard to find on your own, not as accessible through some of the main channels. So um, I hope people will take advantage of that resource to see the great diversity of art in our culture.
Yep. I thank you for mentioning that. I had that in my notes to talk about when we were discussing his Book of Mormon paintings, and I was going to call you like, who knows more in the world about LDS Book of Mormon paintings than Jenny? What is the website for that?
Book of Mormon Art Catalog.org.
Great. Well, this has been such an enlightening discussion. Thank you so much for your work and for your time today. Any final thoughts to share?
Um, I just want to say I love that we got a picture of C.C.A. on the cover as a young man. Whenever I've seen published works on him, he's usually a very old man. And I love those pictures too. But I have not seen this young man photo of him published very much. And I feel like with this title, A Mormon Visionary, you just get that sense of him having this exuberance for what lies ahead. And I was really inspired learning about the way he dedicated his life to what he believed the world could be, and really um, making sacrifices to make that come to pass and to help other people build that kind of a life. And so I felt like that picture of him as a young man looking forward kind of captured that thought for me.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Jenny. And thank you to listeners for your interest in the podcast. You can hear more interviews by going to our website, centerforlatterdaysaintarts.org, by searching the Center Studio podcast on major podcast platforms. And you can view our video version of the interview on YouTube on the Center's channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts too. Send me a note. Thanks, Jenny. And thanks, everybody. Goodbye.